What is our Dharma? What is our quest? Welcome back to Dharma Nights. My name is Matt Murphy, and I'm the host. Today's topic, I wanted to talk about the concept of play. And in Hinduism, there's a word for that called Lila, specifically in the context of like a God coming down and compressing their infinite form and potentiality into the like a mortal form, finite, subject to limitations. And the idea of why they're doing it is a sense of play, like to have an experience or to participate with the reality unfolding around them. And there's some specific things that I had in mind about this concept of play and also of games when it applies to us in our daily life. And, just as a reminder of some of the background, like where I'm coming from with this podcast, is I do my own embodied practices, including yoga, but also including martial arts. And martial arts in particular are a very interesting thing because they simulate life and death struggle in a lot of ways, but it reduces it to play. So when we talk about why societies spend time doing athletic things, making adversarial games where there's winners and losers and there's teams with objectives, and the further back in time you go, the more a lot of these games, you could argue, kind of simulate combat or, struggle of one body against another body where like lives might be on the line. And, you can take it even further back and look into nature to see some use of this concept of play where it plays like a preserving and improving role, where the stakes are lowered. And what do I mean by that? One very colorful example that always comes to mind for me is there's certain kinds of spiders where when they encounter one another in the wild, in like disputed territory between the two of them, they'll engage in a kind of dance. And this dance, experts who see this unfold, their idea is basically that the dance is meant to demonstrate which spider has more sort of athletic ability or more potential to harm the other one. So they kind of do this dance to demonstrate, like, hey, if I wanted to, I could kill you. I could win this struggle for this territory. So let's not even go there. Why don't you just go find some other territory? So plenty of other species, it doesn't go down like that. Plenty of other species, it's a mortal struggle when they're fighting over territory. But this is an example where they reduce something from a state that would normally be sort of like a life or death struggle, and they make it into a kind of play where no one actually gets hurt. And I have to confess that when I've seen dance-offs, particularly like hip-hop dance-offs, break-dancing dance-offs, things like this, where like one person is trying to not just express themselves, but there's a crowd who has some sort of judging component, and there's a definitive winner or loser in the judgment of the crowd or other observers, and some sort of privilege or honor or prize is won in the process. I always think of that thing with the spiders when I see dance-offs like that. And maybe that's just more of a window into my own psychology, but when you also consider that if evolutionary biologists were looking at these sorts of things and they were like chatting with an anthropologist and they were looking at like a dance in a community where like two people are kind of dancing their asses off in maybe a little bit of a competitive way, and one of them goes home with someone and the other doesn't, so dial back to the natural world and all of a sudden it's more like, oh, it's mating season for this particular species, and one of them is going to literally kill the other one for the privilege of mating and continuing its genetic material, right, beyond its own particular body. So these are all forms of play which take the stakes of mortal struggle down a few notches and allow things to continue with a lot less collateral damage and with lowered stakes. Walk yourself back from that viewpoint and you can get into all kinds of other mischief. And I say that mischief in a potentially negative or a potentially positive sense, right? So when we look at a lot of the martial arts that we train, there's such a thing as sparring, or there's such a thing in like the grappling arts as rolling with one another, meaning like, oh, we're just going to have a quick wrestle, and here's the things we're allowed to do, here's the things we're not allowed to do. And one of the peculiar outputs of this process, one of the peculiar outputs is enjoyment and like a blissful joy, and everyone's laughing and having a great time. But the thing that's being extracted or abstracted, I should say, is something that in other circumstances would be a life or death struggle, right? So this is always one of the things that people seem fascinated by when they go to a jiu-jitsu gym for the first time, or similar things like that. They expect everyone to be kind of mean mugging. They expect everyone to be jerks. And actually, if I'm being honest, in some gyms and dojos, there actually is a little bit of that. But in most of them that I've ever been a part of, that's just not a thing. Like, most of them are people having a great time, enjoying themselves, being good people, and kind of helping one another. And there's like just a lot of fun, right? It's like a clubhouse. It's like a really joyful thing to do. But it has its roots in mortal struggle, right? So what is this process that happens when, whether we're talking about like a divine being without limits coming down and willfully taking on limits to have an experience of life, or to like have a Lila, to have a, to play, or like when we as humans engage in these games, which are abstracted versions of mortal struggle with lowered stakes, so that we can like live to play another day, live to struggle another day, right? Rather than some scenario of mutually assured destruction. For me, this is a very special process that happens. And no matter what kind of context we're talking about there's something really magical when you're able to take this attitude and this process and apply it in other parts of your life. This may even seem like a bit of a stretch when I try to shoehorn yoga into this discussion any more than I already have by mentioning, the Hindu concept of Lila, right? But even in other embodied practices that have ostensibly nothing to do with martial arts or combat, like let's say something like yoga, I think a lot of the times some people have this attitude about their yoga where it seems like it's missing that element of play. Like when you get people who are really dedicated to it, particularly if they're very deep into a spiritual practice of it and it becomes like an obsession. These are the sorts of people who in another time and place might have been the forest hermits, right? They might have just like been like, all right, well, I don't really care much about any of my societal obligations at all. I just want to do yoga in the forest all day. So I'll take a mud hut and a mat, and that's fine for me. And the mat would have been like an animal skin, not an actual mat, right? Something like that. So for me, people who reach that level of dedication to other embodied practices that have absolutely, or at least ostensibly, nothing else to do with combat or martial arts or anything like that, sometimes for me, I can tell that they seem to have like abandoned their sense of play a little bit. But I think this is me getting on a soapbox a little bit, but I think that same spirit of Lila or play is something that's very like valuable and has a lot of potential, even if your objective in doing yoga is to reach some sort of more transcendent modality of experience or life, or if we could bust out all the 50-cent words here, like if you want to get in touch with Atman, if you want to, we could go right down the laundry list of all the things, right? Like get your consciousness to be part of a undifferentiated bliss with the greater consciousness that everyone shares, et cetera, et cetera. Get into the God space. Like those are all really wonderful ideas, and you could call them goals, I guess, although a lot of people would dispute that the use of that word in that context. But as wonderful and powerful as all of those intentions and goals and whatever else are, I feel like I missed the memo that says it shouldn't be done with a spirit of play. And the more I learn about these stories, like in the Hindu narratives, which is basically at the very least the outer shell that the yoga philosophy came out of, It may not have been inextricably bound up in that. You could certainly say yoga could be considered an agnostic output of a lot of those Hindu frameworks, and I say that with a plural, not a singular, right? Because Hinduism isn't one static thing. It's like a plurality of so many different things to so many different kinds of people in one of the largest land masses on the planet. Um, to say nothing of the people elsewhere who take their Hinduisms with them, right, outside of the Indian subcontinent, of which there are many and many and many and many, right? But again, I seem to have missed the memo where you're not where if you take this idea seriously that if there is such thing as a divine essence, that you participate in it too. Um, and I missed the memo that says if these other deities can engage in Lila, particularly like let's say Vishnu taking on the form of Ram or Krishna or whatever else, and they get to do this with a spirit of play, or they get to play at having a human or mortal or limited experience when they are by no means obligated to. I don't understand how that wouldn't apply to us if you take that idea seriously that whatever divine essence they have, we have too. And whatever potentiality they have, we have too, whether or not we're aware of it and all that sort of thing. So sometimes I see this like very austere attempt, even in the modern day and age and milieu, where people are just like, they're really getting after their yoga. And somewhere along the way in their own kind of dedication or their obsession, they seem to lose touch with some of that playfulness. And I think this is purely anecdotal observation for me. This is I don't expect everyone else to share this observation. And I think maybe part of it might also be that I know a lot of people come to yoga and similar practices for different reasons. And for some people, it's a refuge from some difficult circumstances in life, right? Like some people come to yoga or even martial arts for that matter, or whatever else, as a refuge from trauma, as a refuge from bad life in like 10 or 20 other kinds of different potential descriptions, right? Like they're coming to this practice as a refuge. They could have chosen anything. They could have said, oh, I'm going to go be a Buddhist and renounce the world and just meditate all day or whatever. But for whatever reason, they chose an embodied practice like yoga or martial arts or something else as a refuge. And so doing this practice as a refuge ends up mattering to them. And doing it correctly, quote unquote, ends up mattering a lot too. And if we jump tracks again to martial arts, maybe part of the obsessive quality of that, of refuge seeking behavior, manifests itself as saying like, oh, I want to get things right in this martial art. I want to win my matches. I want to win my sparring matches. I want to win my roles with my partners, So these sorts of things become like when they're supposed to be rooted in a sense of play, in my opinion, they end up being taken a little bit too seriously. And I can even say, perhaps ironically, like, in the martial arts world, a lot of people will be like, hey, you can't be playful about this because this could be life or death. This could mean your life or death. Like if you have a playful attitude here, it's going to come out in a situation that actually matters, except it's not going to be like, oh, we just had a roll. Let's shake hands and have another one. As opposed to like you just lost a struggle and then someone ends your life, right? Because they're not doing like a consensual game. And I understand that. I would understand that objection, but I can also say at the same time, the vast majority of people I've ever known who really needed something like that in their life or really needed to develop like life defending skills that they could have gotten in those environments were never able to set foot in those environments in a sustained way to begin with because there wasn't some sort of lightness or attitude of play that kept them there. And from the viewpoint of the people running those places, I just don't understand it. But the attitude I would encounter a lot is, well, I guess they weren't meant to survive or something. Like if you brought up that kind of objection, there would be this kind of like, well, you can't save everyone and some people are just weak or whatever. But it's completely incompatible with the whole attitude that is supposed to draw people in the first place in the sales pitch, which is like, oh, do you want to build strength? Do you want to build confidence? Do you want to build the ability to defend yourself? Well, this dojo is what you need, right? But at the same time, they're not doing for I mean, in a lot of these circumstances, they're not really making it easy for the people who would never want to set foot in a real serious environment to begin with. Some dojos, like when they have a real nice recreational jiu-jitsu vibe, they make it a lot easier because people are having fun and they're smiling and like it's a place that people want to go to. But plenty of others, I have people tell me all the time when they visit them, they're like, ugh, I set one foot in that place and it just, no one was smiling, no one was having a good time. They didn't greet me in a friendly way. I would never go back. And what they're usually also saying is not only would I not go back to that particular place, but I would never set foot in a dojo again, period, because I think that's what they're all going to be like. So this is like it's an extremely damaging thing, you know, to lack that sense of play that is so helpful to everyone's mutual welfare and benefit when they go down these paths. And now I can switch back to the modality of yoga again too, right? I like to hop in between these two quite a bit. I can say the same exact thing about yoga studios. Again, people, some of the people who need these things the most end up being the ones who get it the least. And not just because the pricing of some of these things end up being luxury pricing, right? For like a studio membership or gym membership or whatever. But a lot of the people I know who I think really could have used yoga and like used it in a big way. Like when I happen to be very lucky in that the yoga studio that I go to, when I do go to it, is actually run by my partner, and she's amazing, and she's created a wonderful environment. But oh boy, I can say most of the yoga studios that I went to before that didn't have the same vibe. Like a lot of them were very elitist. A lot of them like did not exude the friendly vibe to newcomers. A lot of them were like, you could tell that for them it was about like a physical skill that they had to do well and they wanted to be the best at or whatever. And like a lot of the key students there had the same kind of thing going on. It's not like that at all at my partner's yoga studio, but oh my God, I can't even tell you how many I've gone into where that was a thing. And the same exact thing happened in that circumstance that I just described in martial arts, where there's people where I was like, oh, have you ever tried yoga? Like that could do, it could do so many good things for your life. They would have a story like that they would tell. They'd be like, yeah, I went to this yoga studio near me and just the attitude and the atmosphere was not great. And the people there like seemed like they didn't give a crap about me as a new student. And they didn't really do a lot to make me feel comfortable. And I could tell people were kind of like trying to perform well in a way that seemed competitive and all that kind of stuff. So again, like these are two very different examples of environments that lack that sense of play and joy. And I hate to tie too cute a bow on this, but part of me wants to say, if it's good enough for limitless divine beings to do in this story, right? If it's good enough for them to have this sense of play when they don't have to, why wouldn't that be good enough for you? Like whether you're a martial arts world champion, whether you're a yogi who can do like every part of the Ashtanga series, is all the hard stuff, like the hardest of the hard Anusara series stuff, whatever, I don't care. If it's good enough for all these deities with limitless potential in these stories to do all of that with a sense of play, why wouldn't that be good enough for you, right? So I know it might sound kind of weird for me to reference like deities and stories that may or may not even be real, but the thing is, people wrote those stories or at least compiled them, and the ones who compiled them and wrote them, I guarantee were way deeper into the yoga journey as far as like, living a yoga devoted life where that was all they did all day long, right? Like the sages. For you to have been someone who was writing that material or compiling that material back in the day usually meant you were a serious student of these practices, like serious enough where you would have a lifetime of experience that guided your process of compiling and writing these materials. And it's very clear when you go through the texts, whether we're talking about Valmiki's Ramayana or whether we're talking about like the core recognized version of the Mahabharata, or the Puranas or whatever else, like these are stories that were compiled by people who knew what they were talking about and had a lifelong spiritual experience and practice, right? It's very clear to me. So even if we were to say, like, okay, well, yeah, let's not even acknowledge that the deities in these stories are real, because honestly, like, we could have a very long conversation about that, and my opinion about that would probably surprise 90% of my listeners, right? But um, even above and beyond that, like, if in the viewpoint of these people who, in my opinion, as the authors or compilers, reached a noticeable spiritual mastery that you could devote a lifelong study to in terms of like dissecting the texts and getting value out of it for your entire life, if their conclusion, if it was good enough for them to say like, hey, this is all about an experience of play, like if it was good enough for them, why isn't it good enough for you in your like suburban town where, or whatever, like where you're doing martial arts or yoga or whatever else? Like, why would a spirit of play not be good enough for you? Like, even if you're world champion, even if you're whatever else. And there are examples of world champions and other top performers in these disciplines who who other people around them, like their other peers, their other competitive peers or whatever else, would say when they met them, like, yeah, when we train with the guy, he just has a good time. And like, one of the examples that always comes up to me is in the fight world, there was this guy with a professional wrestling background named Kazushi Sakuraba, uh, like from a professional catch wrestling kind of background in Japan. And at a time when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys like the Gracie family was just beating everyone, and they were the ones to beat, he beat every single representative of their family and every other major Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player that anyone ever sent at him. But he didn't. Not only did he beat them, but he did it while deliberately trying to do it in a way that was entertaining for the crowd. And he tried, like, he would come out in a mask and he would have like goofy smiles on when he fought if the camera happened to catch him in the right angle. It was just very clear that he was doing the whole thing with a sense of play, to delight crowds. And like, on the one hand, very clearly took what he was doing seriously, but on the other hand, like, it was very clear that he was just having a good time, and he's by no means the only example that I can think of when this concept comes to mind for me. There are so many top performers in so many different practices who got where they are and sustained where they were because they just had a good time doing it, right? And it's not that the outcome didn't matter to them. It's not all these other things, but they did it with the spirit of play and exploration. So for me, this is like a world redeeming quality. And if I had to make a theory about why the divine would do this in these stories, like, like Vishnu taking on limited mortal form and all this sort of thing, there's all kinds of pragmatic reasons why they might have done it. But there's another one, which is kind of like a money shot for me, which is a spirit of play both recreates the world and redeems the world. So I'm going to end it on that note, and it's worth me saying it again. A spirit of play both recreates the world, like for the one playing and for everyone else. It both recreates the world and redeems the world. So thanks for listening, guys. Hopefully you get some sort of value out of that, and let me know what you think.